All right, let's talk about ecology. Ecology is the study of organisms interacting in their environment. This includes organisms interacting with each other, for example, plants and animals interacting in trophic levels, and also those organisms interacting with their non-living environment. So when we talk about biotic factors, we're talking about the components that are living or were once alive. So these include decomposing or decaying or dead organisms. Then the abiotic factors are the things that were never alive. For example, water is not alive. So water availability would be an abiotic factor. Temperature, climate, soils, geology, all the things that were never alive have nothing to do with living organisms. But these things work together. All of the biotic factors are a result of those abiotic factors in the landscape, and this is the study of ecology. So we're going to use the Hayman Fire area as our case study in this talk. The Hayman Fire occurred in 2002. It was the largest recorded wildfire to date in Colorado. Hayman Fire area is southwest of Denver and northwest of Colorado Springs. So just as you enter the mountains in that forested area between these urban centers. A town in the Hayman Fire is Deckers. You might be familiar with that. The information I gathered here is from my own experience of being there, but also from reading the Hayman Fire case study, which is a technical report released by the USFS. You can follow this link and learn much more about the Hayman Fire area and the fire effects by following that link. All right, so here's what it looks like in the post-fire regime. We see that there's regeneration. These are grasses. They could have burned but are growing back no problem. We see that this was a crowned stand replacing fire. These are the remnants of the original forest there. And then we can see greenery here. There is revegetation occurring. Most of this really spiky stuff is mullein, which is a non-native species, but it still holds soil and prevents erosion nonetheless. So the Hayman Fire really got out of control, and the reason why it went out of control had a lot to do with these abiotic factors. The geology, topography, and climate had the greatest influence on this habitat, the habitats and ecosystems located in the region. Then, to add insult to injury, the granitic soils are highly erodible, more than almost any other soils found in the United States. We call it decomposed granite, DG, and this is the Pikes Peak granite. Makes ball bearings for a surface when it degrades, and this creates huge erosion concerns. So let's take a look at the trees themselves. So the burned trees provide a lot of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are things that occur because an organism is there. So in the case of all the down wood, it adds complexity to our streams, which increases the stream habitat. The dead trees themselves create habitat for small mammals, birds, and invertebrates. And in this dry climate, these trees are likely to store carbon for a very long time, which just basically means they will not decompose. So they're still providing that carbon storage ecosystem service after the burn. So we're going to look at several species that are found there. And what I want you to think about throughout this entire talk is the relationship between the living, the biotic, and the abiotic factors. This is ecology. So every slide here is going to be an example of ecology. So here are some very attractive invertebrates, pleasing fungus beetle. They feed on the fruiting bodies of fungi that decompose dead wood. So here we are in a landscape that has a lot of dead wood now. And also there are a lot of drainages, so there is that moisture needed to decompose wood as long as it's in the riparian areas. If it's up in the upland like we saw 2 slides ago, here these pieces of woody debris are not likely to decompose. But ones that fall on the ground near streams and creeks will likely decompose and create all sorts of habitat for invertebrates. Lichen is an interesting symbiosis of algae and fungus. So these patterns here that you see on rocks, these are actually biotic components of the environment. Lichen, it's an organism that is slow to develop, but very tolerant of environmental conditions because the symbiosis affords both the fungus and the algae the opportunity to take up nutrients from the soil, well, or from the rock surface and from the atmosphere, and also produce photosynthetic products. So the algae does the photosynthesis, the fungus does the job of absorbing nutrients. So together, they are obligate, they have to live together. They create an organism we call lichen. Also in the Hayman area, we see non-vascular plants. The example here is mosses. These are bryophytes that lack a vascular system. Without a vascular system, an organism absolutely needs to be proximate to water because reproduction occurs through the availability of water in the environment rather than the movement of photosynthetic products, water, and nutrients through the vascular system. So you might think to yourself, geez, it's looked awful dry there. How is it possible that there are mosses growing that require water for reproduction? Well, there are a lot of microsites in these steep canyons where there is a lot of moisture, and there are creeks in the canyons, and therefore there is a locally humid environment that can support these mosses. We also see mosses, in our high elevation forests in Colorado, where again it's dark and damp for a lot of the year. Here's another photo of mosses. Here we see something that is a never-ending perplexity for students. The alternation of generations in plants. Oops, sorry about that. So in the moss, you can see very clearly the gametophyte and the sporophyte, and they're coexisting here. Whereas in flowering plants, you cannot really see the gametophyte. It's a very, very inferior component of the plant, and what you consider the plant, in quotes, is the sporophytic generation. So here we see that the gametophytes are the leafy parts, and the sporophytes are these stems with these capsules, and these capsules are the sporangia where the spores are released, and they catch on a water molecule and literally are transported external of the plant body for fertilization to occur. So in addition to non-vascular plants, we have vascular plants in the Hayman area. We have dicots and monocots. We're going to look at another example of dicots and monocots later, but remember some of the very key differences are the venation. So the design of the vascular system is different in dicots and monocots. Here we have a monocot with parallel venation and dicots with a branched venation. And if you look carefully here, you can kind of see that. Also be noticing in all these photos this soil underneath. What is this? This is a whole bunch of undecomposed living, i.e. or once living, biotic material. Alright, so I mentioned there's steep slopes in the Hayman area, contributes to erosion, also really concentrates the moisture into these seams. Here we have the recovering riparian zone. Most willow species have rhizomes, and essentially these are underground roots, so that facilitate vegetative reproduction. Then there's also sexual reproduction. So these little fuzzy things on willows are called catkins, and this is actually the flower. And this contains the reproductive components, and so through wind pollination, willows can colonize new areas, and it's quite windy in most riparian zones. Willows are obligate phreatophytes. They're water loving. They have to have their roots in the water table. That's why you see them really concentrated right in the riparian area. And this right here is only a couple of feet away, but this is the upland. This is above the water table. So we don't see the salix species there. So I mentioned that the willow were wind pollinated, and there's other species of willow that wind pollinate as well. Here we have the alder, okay? And alders are interesting plants because they are deciduous, but they have reproductive parts that are very similar to conifers. Female catkins, and these are wind pollinated. And alder, just like salix, are found in the riparian zones. See the similarity in their reproductive parts. And this is an appropriate pollination scheme for the ecosystem characteristics we're describing. These are obligate phreatophytes. They need to be near water. Well, check. Here it is, right near the water. And it can be quite windy in riparian areas and windy in Colorado in general. And these species are adapted for wind pollination. So we can see the wind playing a role in these upland species as well. So this is the same photo we were just looking at. But notice here in the upland, the landscape is dominated by angiosperms, specifically grasses. There are forbs here, flowering dicots, but the dominant species are grasses. These are also wind pollinated. They're also rhizomatous. They have fibrous root systems, and this is an adaptation for drought tolerance. So notice, they're right next to each other, but they have exploited the environment in totally different ways. So grasses are able to go completely dormant when there are xeric conditions, when it's very, very dry. And from that stored root mass, they can regenerate when water is available. The fibrous root systems give or are able to exploit moisture from precipitation because they can absorb the water very quickly with high surface area. Whereas these salix species and alder species we were looking at before, they have a totally different root strategy. They have tap roots that keep their feet deep in the water table. So when we get to the gray area of abiotic and biotic factors, we get to soil. So I mentioned before that, you know, anything that was once alive is a biotic factor. So we see here pine needles, some leaves, sticks, all sorts of stuff. This is what's making up the biotic component of the soil. The abiotic component of the soil are those granitic particles, mineral particles. So when I first learned about ecology, and I am a trained ecologist, you know, you can't help but be a lover of soil because soil is like the ultimate expression of what's in the environment. It contains fragments of every single thing that's in the environment, whether it be a plant or an animal or an invertebrate. These soils have plant materials, they have decomposing animals in them, they have animal parts like fur, for example, eggshells maybe, vertebrate exoskeletons, and all of that breaks down chemically into what we call soil. The the abiotic components, the mineral components, facilitate like nutrient and water retention in the soils. So we're going to take a real quick look at the faunal species here too. Here's a list. This list is not exhaustive. There are dozens and dozens of species. Although you might be in these environments and not see a lot of organisms, it's important to note that there are many organisms and they are not visible to us, but they are playing a very important role in our survival. They're providing ecosystem services, including things like recreational services in the case of organisms that we could hunt or fish. And so it's important for us to appreciate them too, even though we don't see them on the landscape quite as often because they're afraid of us. So some representative species in the ungulates, so the hooved organisms, are the mule deer and the elk, both grazing in the uplands, in the grasslands. There's also moose. Moose are browse species, so browsers eat stems like branches, and grazers eat grass. So moose are typically found in riparian areas where there's a lot of those willow and alder stems. And these ungulates that are grazers are more on the south-facing slopes in the grasslands. Two species of concern in the Hayman area are the Townsend's big ear bat and the fringed-tailed bat. So these bats look pretty similar. This bat on the edge of its tail has a row of what look like cilia. They're just really fine hairs. So take a look and appreciate that bats are mammals, and they are very, very tiny. And a lot of bats do a local migration. You know, they winter in caves and then come down into the lowlands in the summer. And some bats make really long distance migration. So all species that have migratory tendencies are really imperiled in our fragmented landscape. Here we have some faunal species. So the northern goshawk and the flammulated owl are both raptors. So they're at the top of the food chain. They're in a high trophic level. They consume other animals who consume either other animals or vegetation. And then we have the pygmy nuthatch as well. And here we can see in all three pictures that, of course, avian fauna require trees for habitat. So you can imagine how fire, which would be an abiotic factor, influences their survival. Faunal species, so another category, rodentia, the rodents. There are many waterways in the Hayman area, and they have been engineered by beavers. Beaver are considered second to humans in their ability to engineer the landscape. Their dams can divert water, they can slow water down, increase the sedimentation in the water, and these are pretty big changes for a wild animal to make to the landscape. Then also we have the Preble's metal jumping mouse, another kind of rodent, not necessarily living proximate to the waterways or affecting them, but a species of concern nonetheless. In the Hayman area, we have faunal species, so amphibians like the northern leopard frog and the tiger salamander. Amphibians are imperiled by ecosystem changes because they require both an aquatic and a terrestrial landscape to live. So most amphibians, their offspring are born into an aquatic environment, but they breathe air when they mature, and therefore they need to live in an ecotone between the aquatic and terrestrial landscapes. So thanks for hanging in there and checking out the Hayman Fire case study. I think this is a great example of ecology because we have so many things to think about how the organisms are interacting with each other and their environment. Thank you, and let me know if you have questions.